Hello, I'm Matthew Schreiber, and this is my midterm writing assignment presentation on isolation, biological, and psychological effects. So what is isolation, social isolation? Well, it can be defined most commonly as when an individual is separated from human interaction, right? But it's much more than that. It can be in cases where an individual has their day filled with social interactions, but their physical, psychological, emotional needs are not being met, which are going to lead to feelings of isolation. Now, it's important to note that there's variable perspectives and viewpoints on isolation, and it can change from person to person. An extrovert, right, might require more human interaction to have those biological, psychological, and emotional needs met. Whereas an introvert may require less human interaction to feel that their needs are met and they feel satisfied. It's also important to note that cultural perspectives change on what isolation is. An example would be collectivist societies versus individualistic societies, right? So individualistic societies like Western societies as nations like the United States, UK, or Germany, right? They may view isolation as a personal issue, something that an individual is dealing with on an individual level, and the problem is theirs to fix, and it doesn't relate to the rest of society. Whereas in a collectivist society like Japan, South Korea, or Mexico, where societies view community involvement and strong family relations as a real positive reinforcement for their way of life. They might view social isolation not just as a personal issue, but something that could affect their society as a whole. And they might think of it as something that everyone needs to deal with collectively. One note on that is in 2023, the Surgeon General of the United States put out an advisory trying to shift that perception of isolation in the United States from an individualistic concept to something that's more, relates to society as a whole, and steps we can take to treat isolation and prevent its detrimental effects on Western society. So it doesn't really matter what your viewpoints are on isolation as much, because no matter what your viewpoints are, the biological and physiological effects, psychological effects are very similar. So when we go and talk about biological effects, right, what I found from my research is that it really stems from the increased stress levels that someone suffering from social isolation feels, right? So the higher stress they feel, the less support they have dealing with their own stressors that human interaction can provide, they're more prone to increased stress levels, which means higher stress hormones like cortisol. So what does cortisol do in the body? It activates that fight or flight system, right, in the body, promoting immune response, raising blood pressure, constricting blood vessels, right? And all that can lead to diseases like poor immune health, makes you more susceptible to viral loads, viral infections like the common cold. One study suggested that people who were suffering from social isolation and had elevated stress levels were more susceptible to contracting the common cold. Another thing stress will do, right, is raise your blood pressure. So hypertension, that increased hypertension is going to lead to cardiovascular disease. Something else it does, it's going to activate your body's inflammation system, right? So since it's fighting off a pathogen, it needs to inflame the tissues in the cells, right? And what that's going to lead to, again, is cardiovascular diseases like stroke or myocardial infarction, otherwise known as heart attack. Something else that isolation was strongly correlated with was higher risk and rates of diabetes and obesity. So the thinking behind that was that people suffering from diabetes and obesity, also suffering from social isolation, they're more likely to have a poor diet, they're more likely to have a poor sleep quality, and they're more likely to exercise less, which is going to lead to, of course, diabetes and obesity. Now, one thing important to note is that there's a real bidirectional relationship between stress, sleep quality, poor diet, lack of exercise, and chronic disease, right? So you might be suffering higher stress levels from social anxiety. You have that lack of social support. You're having to face those daily stressors on your own, right? That's going to affect your sleep quality. Your sleep quality is going to affect the rest of your health. You might be eating less healthy food, which is again going to affect your stress. You're going to worry about the food you're eating. It's going to affect your sleep quality. And again, it's going to lead to chronic diseases. The more chronic diseases you develop, right, it's going to raise that stress level, make it harder to sleep, make it harder to eat healthier. All right, so there's a real bidirectional correlate or bidirectional effect that takes place with all the symptoms associated with social isolation. And it creates like this cascading effect that just only exacerbates the problem over time. Now, it's not just biological effects, right? Psychological effects is a huge part of social isolation. And again, I noticed that stress is almost like a cornerstone, right? It's that first symptom that creates the rest of the problems that are associated with social isolation. So again, those elevated stress levels will raise those hormone levels of cortisol in the body, all right? And that can cause all kinds of issues throughout. So one of them being cognitive performance, all right? So higher stress levels, less sleep, all right? One study suggested that there's a strong correlation between social isolation and cognitive performance at work, right? So if you're socially isolated, again, you have that lack of social support, help you deal with daily stressors, your sleep quality is gonna suffer, right? Your diet's gonna suffer, and in turn, your cognitive performance is gonna suffer. Again, cognitive decline, all right? So it's not just those short-term things like cognitive performance, but it's gonna have long-term effects. Cognitive decline, neural damage to the hippocampus. So one study suggested that the inflammatory nature of the high levels of cortisol throughout the body over prolonged periods of time can have physically damage the neural networks of your brain that are responsible for cognitive function, right? That hippocampus, that prefrontal cortex, those neural networks can be damaged by the chronic inflammation associated with stress, right? And that's going to lead to, long-term disorders like depression, dementia. So, depression is one of the common things I found associated with social isolation, right? So the thinking behind that is that, again, those high elevated stress levels, right, coming from the lack of social support, is increasing a person's depression, right? The thinking behind that is that the elevated stress levels that a person feels, is going to, again, affect the rest of their life, all right? But it's also going to affect their positive mental attitude. It's going to affect their confidence, all right? And it's going to lead to rumination or the constant thinking of negative thoughts or, those daily stresses that you face in your life. So without that social support, those negative thoughts, can affect feelings of loneliness, increase feelings of sadness, ultimately leading to depression, right? And combine that with the neural damage that affects the emotional regulation and processing centers of the brain, right? It's going to make it harder for them to process those emotions in a healthy manner, right? Increasing the rate or risk of developing depression, right? Now, again, a long-term effect, all right? There's strong correlation between socially isolated individuals and the development of dementia later in life. So the thing behind that, again, is that lack of daily interaction that helps to preserve and sustain cognitive function, right? It's like cognitive function is like a muscle almost, where you got to exercise it continuously throughout your life. And if you're not having those social interactions daily, you're not strengthening those muscles, or in this case, those neural connections, like logical reasoning, problem solving, abstract thinking, conversation skills, and again, emotional regulation, right? All things that can lead to developing dementia later in life, right? So that's really the basis of the biological effects and the psychological effects of social isolation. So obviously social isolation can affect your social life, right? Because that lack of social life stops you from developing the steps you need to prevent social isolation. So something interesting I was reading was that the more time you spend in social isolation, those symptoms and the effects of it make it harder to break away and break free from that social isolated environment. So, what can we do about it? Well, again, the Surgeon General put out a 2023 advisory talking about the social epidemic in the United States, the social isolation epidemic in the United States. And, there's tons of things they recommended. One of them being volunteering, volunteering for, political events, getting involved in the community, neighborhood beautification projects, volunteering at homeless shelters, anything where you can get out there, put yourself in an environment where you're dealing with other people and create those social interactions. Again, sports leagues or exercise classes, so adult, basketball leagues, soccer leagues, softball leagues, anything like that, again, where you're promoting those social interactions. Exercise classes like yoga, group stretching classes, anything again, promoting those social interactions, creating an environment where you're exercising those cognitive muscles. Social clubs, adult classes. So social clubs, you're going to book clubs, reading, adult classes. Currently my mother-in-law is taking language classes, and every week she'll go and meet at a club where they only speak in Spanish. That's a great way to improve your social interaction throughout the week. Now, social media, this was touched on in the U.S. Surgeon General's advisory. It has pros and cons. Many of the cons we know is that extensive use of social media, screen time, can exacerbate the problem of social isolation, stop someone from getting out there, talking to people. But it also has many benefits, right? Social media has allowed people to connect with friends and relatives no matter where they are in the world, right? And the advisor really talked about using that technology as a tool to increase your social interactions, right? It wasn't, only about 15 years ago where FaceTime just wasn't a real thing and wasn't reliable. But nowadays, you can contact friends and family and loved ones from around the world in an instant and have valuable, meaningful conversations that are going to stretch those cognitive muscles and just really help a person feel fulfilled and have their biological, psychological, and social needs met. So that's really what the difference between the pros and cons of social media use is, and how we can use it to combat the effects of social isolation. Now, I want to talk about some things I learned researching this paper, things that really surprised me. One was when I started this research paper or this essay, I thought I was really diving into like a niche concept and something that wasn't well documented. And I quickly learned that it was absolutely the opposite. So this topic of social isolation and its biological and psychological effects is well researched, well documented, and there was just a plethora of information out there. And what I really found challenging was just picking out the subtopics and really focusing on like, what can I do to generalize this issue? And it was a real challenge because you had to differentiate between research that focus on specific parts of social isolation and its effects. But what I really wanted to do was show like the general big picture of the biological and psychological effects of social isolation. Something else I learned while researching for this paper was just how worldwide this problem is. I really thought that this was kind of a one-time issue that stemmed from COVID-19. That's what I was reading about. But really, it's been an ongoing issue for years and years and years, and it has different levels of severity in different societies. Again, going back to that individualistic versus collectivistic societies. So in Western societies, it's a more prevalent problem, but that's not to say they have definite issues in collectivistic societies. They're facing their own problems with social isolation. Those are two things that I really took away from this. And then, how it affects a person's longevity. I was really unaware of how detrimental it is long term. I was aware that increases rates of dementia, and that it's linked to depression. But I was really surprised by how immediate it affects immune health, hypertension, inflation, cardiovascular disease. So it was really surprising that ultimately, people who are suffering from prolonged periods of social isolation die faster. The mortality rates from people suffering from social isolation is much higher than individuals who are suffering without. So that's really the gist of social isolation and its biological and physiological effects. It's obviously a much more complicated issue, and really I could write a 50-page paper on this and not really break down everything involved with all the effects of social isolation. Thank you.